Well, yeah, Gandhi was the first Prime Minister of India after India became independent. India got its independence in 1947, another date I guess I'll write down, 1947. Israel was formed in 1948. 1947 India, 1948, 1949, that's the year that China became communist. A lot happened right about then. The World War II was over and the nations of the world began giving up their colonies. And the whole world underwent a whole bunch of somewhat shocking changes. Do you remember the figure I gave you? A Japanese CEO makes how much greater than the average worker in Japan? 17. In the United States, it's more like more than 50 to 1. The average CEO in the United States makes more than 50 times what the average worker makes in Japan, only 17 times more. Okay. Oh yes, when Lenin took over Russia, he changed its name to Soviet Union, but he also took over all of Russia's industries. So basically, he's making a communistic, socialistic state. The word Soviet Union comes from the Union of Soviet Socialistic Republics. It meant that all farmland was now owned by the state and all factories owned by the state. When some 10 million or more of them starved to death, maybe 25 million of them starved to death, in time of a good economic harvest, by the way, they finally got rid of some of their state farms and gave the farms back to the local people. But it took some doing to get them to do that. Oh yes. What are, and this is making some, reparations. No, it has nothing to do with the Catholic Church. Reparations. Yeah, reparations is where you pay a person that you have offended. Mm-hmm. And it was done after World War I when the winning nations, against Wilson's objections, tried to force Germany to pay the cost of World War I. It led to Germany starting World War II, and after World War II, there were no reparations required. It's just instead the United States went in and rebuilt Germany. And Germany has been our friend ever since. We also went in, under Douglas MacArthur, we rebuilt Japan. And to some extent, we helped rebuild Vietnam after we bombed a lot of it. And this has helped to make these people our friends and not our enemies anymore. All right. In China, the practice of female foot binding when did it end? I mean, not years in terms of years, but what caused it to end? Somebody said something. Foot binding. It ended when the communists took over China. The communists took over in 1949. In 1950, the communist government passed a law or decreed a law that foot binding was to stop. In the countryside, it was slower because sometimes these communist decrees did not always reach the countryside. But as far as I know, now the authors of your book will say that they saw women who'd had their feet bound when they visited China in the 1980s. I don't doubt there were still a few of those women around then, because it had been outlawed for more than 30 years when they visited China. But today, and if there are any women who had their feet bound, they're very, very old. The practice, as far as I know, has been completely stopped. Foot binding.
What's the purpose of that?
Okay.
Make their women more submissive?
Make them more submissive. I mean, number one, to prevent them from running off. That's what I've heard. But there's another story that it changed the shape of their legs and made them more attractive to the men, particularly during the sex act. Now, I know any American man is going to say, I don't find a crippled woman attractive. Well, but the Chinese men apparently did. They guaranteed that they would not run off. They couldn't run. So basically, the girls could not engage in athletics, things like that, but they couldn't run off either. But the idea was to keep the women subservient, which I guess for the most part it did. And here, I'm going to quote the book now. The book says that the Chinese men continued to look on women during the 17 and 1800s as worthless sex objects. I mean, that's a quote from the book. Not that they were that way, but that's what the Chinese people looked on them as. But the practice was stopped in 1950. All right. In about 1964, I believe, Martin Luther King Jr., Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., led a march on Washington, in which he made his famous I Have a Dream speech. And this led to the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. I have a dream. He said, I have a dream that someday all children, black and white, will be able to play together. That there'd be no more white schools and no more black schools, even though today the schools in the country are more segregated than ever. But by choice, not by mandate. It's by choice. Oh, yes. In order to encourage people to buy homes, now, pardon me, after I'm talking about the United States, after World War II, the United States government passed the GI Bill, but the GI Bill not just included money to help young men go to college who had fought in the war. It also included home loans. In other words, where GI could get a home loan without making a down payment.
Right.
Now, this meant that if you were a veteran, and this law is still in the books, if you're a veteran and you've served in the Army for a certain number of years, you can look at a house and decide to buy. You don't have to put any money down. You do have to pay the mortgage. You have to put any money down. Whereas if you're not a veteran, you have to put down so much money, a few $1,000s, several thousand. Only then will they give you a loan. But if you get a VA loan, the VA loan will cover 100% of the cost of that house, the market value of that house. So that was another part of the GI Bill. And again, it encouraged home ownership. Now, a lot of homes built right after World War II were built in factories. You don't see that anymore. But here's a folk. My dad was always against these factory-built homes. You'd put together the walls and the ceiling in a factory, and then get that same house out in the field, and oftentimes one wall would not fit with another. And again, because, let's face it, a lot of the land was not perfectly flat and level, and even if it were, it's just, I mean, you know, one crew would work on this wall, another crew would work on the ceiling, another crew would work on the floor, and one of them might be 1/4 of an inch off in his measurements, or even 1/8 of an inch off, and it wouldn't fit. So today, you don't have factory-built homes anymore, at least if you do, I don't know about them. Homes are built on site. By crews. Yeah.
But let me answer this question. Didn't mean to cut you off in
Yeah, go
mid-sentence. Okay, so what happens when you're on the freeway driving 285 and you see a home or
Now, those are mobile homes, so.
mobile home. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, I should clarify. Now, mobile homes are still on, they're still popular, and they're still cheaper than a regular house. But you'll see maybe a split half, you'll see half of a house, and another half. But see, that house was already put together before it left the factory. So you can then get the house on the property it's going to be sitting on, and then a crew of men get together and they'll fit it together, right at the seam, fit it together. And they sometimes make, they're really nice looking homes, and they are inexpensive. The first house I owned was a trailer. But generally trailers are ideal for poor people and whatever. Also trailers, they're often blown away when a strong wind hits. They don't stand up as well as regular houses for whatever reason. Oftentimes, most of the time they're made of metal, and that has its problems also, attracting lightning or attracting other. It's attracting lightning. I lived in a mobile home for 2 years and sold it and bought a house. This was when I was still single. All right. Now, where was Napoleon's last battle? Waterloo. His last battle was a battle of Waterloo, and he lost it. I mentioned how that George Washington and Napoleon's life overlapped by several years. George Washington won 4 of his battles and lost 13. But George Washington won his last battle. Napoleon won 40 victories. I don't know, he lost a few along the way, but he did not win his last one. And in war, that's really what matters, that final victory or that final defeat that counts. Anyway, Napoleon. Now, when Napoleon invaded Russia, what served to whip him in Russia?
a cold.
Cold Russian winter, and his men were not prepared for it. The same thing was to do Hitler in 1940. Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, and the cold snap hit 3 weeks before Hitler had thought it would, and caught Hitler's men out in the cold. All the Russians had to do was go to the barracks or go to the supply and check out the parkas. They had the winter equipment. They could handle the cold. The German armies, whom I left out in the cold, to freeze to death and become shell-shocked.
What was the third? Was it Austria that also got wiped out?
There were 3 countries that invaded Russia. Sweden. Charles XII of Sweden invaded Russia, and you might think that Sweden has a colder, but actually Sweden gets, the Gulf Stream brings some warmer air to Sweden, so Sweden is not as cold as Russia is. And during it's called the Great Northern War, a supply wagon would be arriving, and the men, oh wait, here comes supplies, and why doesn't the man driving a wagon move? They'd find he was sitting there frozen to death. Well, this happened more than once. But the Swedish army froze to death, largely froze, and the Napoleon's army froze outside, and Hitler's was even worse. Hitler's men were not even prepared. They didn't even have the winter coats. These winters can fool you. Oh yes, folk, this is something now I just noticed, I never have mentioned. There was a change made during the French Revolution that is still going on. I mean, okay, when the French Revolution took place, they changed the calendar for a while, and they dated the time from the storming of Bastille, which was supposed to be a big event. Well, that didn't last. They also got rid of Christianity. Well, obviously that didn't last. But they did make one change that did last: the metric system. Now, the metric system is a system where the things that go by using units of 10. Notice you have, well, for instance, in distances, you have the meter, which is a little bit longer than our yard. Then a tenth of a meter is a decimeter. A hundredth of a meter is a centimeter. A thousandth of a meter is a millimeter. But then going up, 1,000 meters is a kilometer. A kilometer is roughly 3/5 of a mile. A lot of persons believe it's a better system. Now, in the early 1970s, our country started to go metric, but we did a study of it and decided it would cost way, way, way far too much money, and we didn't. In temperatures, 0 degrees is a freezing point of water, 100 is a boiling point of water, and temperature measured in Celsius. Some of you might have studied the metric system in school. You might be from a country where the metric system is used. There are persons who believe the metric system is better than the English system we use. I've read books about that. Even in Thomas Jefferson's day, they asked Thomas Jefferson, do you really want to adopt a metric system? He spoke against it. The reasons are almost metaphysical, folk. I mean, I don't want to get into it. But anyway, to make a long story short, the United States has never adopted, and now does not appear even close to adopting the metric system. We're using the same system that was used by mankind for many, many a generation. There are people who believe that our English system we use, the inch, the yard, the foot, the mile, is better than the metric system of meters. All right, but anyway, the metric system is still widely in use today. It was a change made during the French Revolution. The changes are still going on. Okay. Oh yes, the French Revolution made a big change in warfare. Anybody remember what it was? I mentioned this at least once. A huge change. They recruited every citizen who was able to fight. Before this, kings would hire professional soldiers, and they'd send these professional soldiers to the battlefield to do their fighting for them, and sometimes even hired foreigners. Anyone who was willing to fight. These foreigners were called mercenaries. But beginning with the French Revolution, when France found itself about to be, the Queen of France, Marie Antoinette, was an Austrian. When France faced an enemy from Austria, Spain, Great Britain, and Russia, and Holland, the French said, hey, we can't fight all of them. So they drafted every man in the army, able-bodied or not, and said everybody except for the extremely feeble can do something. And they put everybody to work on their war machine. And this was the beginning of what we call total war. Napoleon followed up with this to use total war tactics. But the nations of Europe then followed up, but they drafted all their able-bodied men also. And the result was total war was to be what World War I and World War II was to be fought with, where that everybody was subject to being drafted into the armies. The United States did the same thing in both world wars. The draft age was 21 to 35. They took volunteers, 18 without your parents' consent, 17 with your parents' consent, and up to 45 if you were able-bodied. As I said, 21 to 35 was the draft age, up to, they took volunteers up to 45. Oh yes, here's the sad part of the story, folk, for me. King Louis XVI of France only engaged in one war. He won it. But the war cost him so much that it depleted his treasury and ultimately led to his head being chopped off. What war did he engage in? The American Revolutionary War. Yeah, he gave aid to the United States during the American Revolutionary War. And while he was spending all this money sending his army across the Atlantic Ocean and sending his navy, across the Atlantic Ocean, they won. Yes. But he wound up getting in the meantime, his wife, Marie Antoinette, the Austrian woman, was busy building a big, magnificent, multi-million-dollar park that ultimately got her head chopped off too. Sad to say, the war he engaged in was the American Revolution, which was a success.
That was King Louis the who?
Louis the 16th.
Thanks.
Louis the 17th was a son of Louis the 16th, and Louis the 18th was a brother of Louis the 16th. Three of those brothers became kings. Louis the 16th was the first one, Louis the 18th was the second one, and Charles the 10th was the third one. Yes, these kings often gave more than one son the same name. We have a man in our country who's done the same thing. George Foreman has 5 sons and named all 5 of them George. George 1, George 2, George 3, George 5. George Foreman got out of boxing for a good many years, and after he went back to the ring and won the world championship the second time. All right, so much for that. Okay, folks, with that, I'm a little bit earlier than I said I'd be, but with that,